Hello YouTube, Hawaiian Shirt Coder here again. Want to host your website for nothing? Let's have a look at how you can do that through Azure Static Web Apps. So welcome along, Hawaiian Shirt Coder here again. It's been a while, but I've decided to do a little series of videos on YouTube, all to do with how you can host your website for free using a really useful service that exists in Azure called Azure Static Web Apps. At the time of recording, not sure how many videos in question I'm going to do. But we'll see how that plays out. In this particular video, we're just going to walk through some of the theory before moving on to some demos in some future videos. So just to walk you through what the purpose of this series is, it's to show off a great service that comes with Azure called Azure Static Web Apps. And in this particular video we will say what is a static web app, what are the advantages of a static web app, and then in some future videos we will do some demos. This whole series is not big on actual code detail, it's just showing different coding frameworks that can be used within the Azure Static Web App sort of environment. So what you will need to follow along for this course is not a great deal, and they all have something in common, which you'll see right now. So first of all, you will need a GitHub account, which is free to sign up to. So just go to github.com, create yourself an account for free, and this is where your code for your static web apps will live. This will be your repository. The next thing you need is a place to host your static website or websites, and we're going to do that using Azure. So you will need an Azure account. Again, this is free to sign up. There is probably the possibility that you will need to enter a credit card because you just sign up to Azure in its entirety, but the facilities and services that we're going to use in this series are Azure Static Web Apps, and they will be free for all intents and purposes, so it shouldn't cost you any money. And then finally, and this is optional, you will need an editor installed on your machine so you can tweak the code to your static web app. Save it, it will get pushed back up into your repository, which will be GitHub, which will in turn go off and generate a build and a deployment to the Azure Static Web App. So we need an editor that we can make changes to our code. If you don't want to download an editor, you can make changes in line within the GitHub account by editing a particular file, but I'm going to actually have a piece of software or an editor installed on my machine, probably Visual Studio in my case, but both Visual Studio Community Edition and VS Code are both free. Please feel free to use the editor of your choice. So that gives us all the prerequisites that we need for this short course. Now we're going to get on to some of the theory before we get to some of the more fun demos. So first of all, what is a static web app? So a static web app is an Azure service, of which there are hundreds of services in Azure now, that will automatically let you build and deploy a static content website. And by static content we mean a website that does not need any server-side rendering. So for example, you would not be able to use this service in Azure for an ASP.NET MVC website or a Java servlets website or a PHP website or a Blazor server website. This all needs to be static content, so everything needs to be in the browser. So that normally means that we're talking about things like HTML, CSS, style sheets and JavaScript. There are some extra bits and pieces that you can also include in that list that I haven't put there, and we'll get to those in a future video. Also with a static website, so the pages aren't going to change by default. They are static brochureware sort of websites. Based on the front end framework that you use to produce this static content, you may also be able to make requests to a back-end service in order to request new updated data. So a static web app is perfect for things like a SPA, a single page application. And I just thought I'd include this diagram, and this diagram is included and it's actually pinched from the Microsoft Learn website, and it sort of just depicts what a Azure static web app is. So over here is our code, which we've probably written in Visual Studio or VS Code or the editor of our choice. We have got this code hooked up so it can talk to our repository, which there's a choice of repositories that you can use. In our examples and demos that we're going to do, it's going to have a repository that lives in GitHub, but it can also be in Azure DevOps if you wish. By doing this in GitHub, we can set up something called GitHub Actions, which basically deal with our CI/CD pipeline. So what happens is we make some code changes, we submit them up to our repository, in our case GitHub. This will trigger a build and a deployment in GitHub Actions, which in turn knows how to deploy that static content or your website up to Azure Static Web Apps. You can also see here in the Microsoft picture that they've also depicted that we can include some sort of API, which isn't part of static web apps, but can communicate with an API, in this case an Azure function, in order to pull additional information. But in essence, it's this flow. So that's basically the flow that Microsoft state that you get with a static web app. So what are the advantages of a static web app? Well, there are quite a few, and the key takeaway is that for all intents and purposes it is free. So it is free hosting for your website. Free web hosting for static content. That's the key takeaway from this, so that's great. It's not going to cost you anything to host this, certainly for your personal stroke hobby projects, or even to a great extent more sort of full-on enterprise sort of SPA based applications. And should you get to the stage where it sort of outgrows the capabilities of it being free, there is a next tier up that is paid. But even that is very, very cheap. Some of the other advantages of static web apps, also known as SWAs, can integrate with back-end services. So we've got a load of static content, but we can make HTTP RESTful calls, for example, to some sort of third-party web service or Azure function, or something like that, to retrieve some extra data that we can inject back into our static content. one of the nice things that makes this very quick is it's a simple integration with GitHub or Azure DevOps to create a pipeline. So every time we said this before, that you post in a change, it instantly fires a build and the site is updated in a matter of minutes. You'll find one overall advantage of static web apps that I've put on here is setting them up is very, very quick. It's like a 10-minute job, basically, from having some code on your machine to having a GitHub repository to having a site that's actually published out, that's publicly viewable by anyone in the world. Some other spin-offs from static web apps is that they can be globally distributed, so they can be in multiple Azure centers around the world, and you can do that just by some simple configuration within the Azure portal. You can add custom domains to your static web apps, so we'll see when we get into the demos that when we quickly spin up a static web app, Azure will give it a made up URL that's not very memorable. It's very easy to swap that out to a domain name that you have purchased. So for example, www.mysite.com. Another nice feature that you get completely free again is you will get an SSL certificate with your static website. So all of static websites start HTTPS, so that's good as well. We've got some authentications and integrations that we can do. So in order to authenticate who the user is, we can use Active Directory, GitHub, Twitter, or other providers. And finally, we have a CI support, command line interface support way of producing static web apps and simulating a static web app sort of environment locally before you push it, and that's available at this address. Time allows, during this video series, I may have a separate video just on this particular aspect, the command line interface, but we'll see how we get on. So that's all I wanted to talk about in this session. In the next video session, we'll actually start doing the first of a few demonstrations just to show you how easy it is to set up and deploy your first static web app. So I'm the Hawaiian shirt coder. Remember, keep learning, keep exploring, keep developing, and please, if you like these videos, please click the like and please subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.